We're delighted to have our lecture here in this fabulous setting. I'm kind of a bit apprehensive almost that I've been with APEX for 7 years. It seemed a very quick process, albeit in various different roles. One of the things about APEX that has always grabbed me is the real commitment and the compassion and expertise and professionalism from all our staff, from the very north of Scotland down to the southwest. There are in our society inevitably individuals with a mix of barriers which prevent them from playing a full part in society. They can have issues, past convictions, drug, alcohol misuse, housing problems, physical or mental health difficulties, poor family relationships. Access to education has been a problem for them and they haven't been able to use it, and they've got unemployment. The vast majority of the service users of APEX just want to be able to participate in society in the same way as everyone else. As opposed to most of us, that doesn't seem to be a terrible thing, and yet it's a very difficult thing. They want to be able to have the range of choices that most of us take for granted. Now, we all have choices to make in life, and there are often consequences of the choices. But when you face some of the barriers I mentioned earlier, you can understand how difficult it is and how the choice can be severely limited. This is the essence of what APEX is all about, supporting and enabling people in order that they're in a position to make better informed choices which can benefit their future. That may be through providing real job skills, enabling them to understand what past convictions can mean for their future employment opportunities, or giving back to their community through volunteering schemes, gaining real work through our social enterprise, or supporting them into specific training or employment elsewhere. Or even within, it was a real pleasure for me in Alloa about 2 years ago. I was talking to a member of our staff who explained to me she had previously been a service user and had moved through various processes in APEX and had ended up being employed as the best candidate for a particular post in our staff. That's the sort of thing that gives you a real buzz. We also seek to improve the so-called soft skills of our service users so that they feel more confident and better able to deal with the challenges life throws at them. As an organisation, we believe passionately in progression, whether this be for service users or for the organisation itself. And internally, we've looked at issues. We've developed a new asset management information system because that enables us to give comprehensive information to our funders who rightly seek that. But it also shows the progress made by individual service users. All this work is done against a backdrop of reducing public sector budgets, ongoing change as a result of the Scotland Act, the significant changes occurring in criminal justice, community justice, and the proposed devolution of greater powers to schools. They all impact on APEX and our service users. The Scottish Government has made it clear that increased employability and ultimately employment is key to the future well-being of Scotland and its citizens. While that's an aim we fully support, it presents significant challenges given the changes and economic environment I mentioned. We know we cannot rely on the old way of doing things where the public sector will always be able to fund services designed to support disadvantaged individuals. We need to have a different response to different situations. With that in mind, we have asked Fraser Kelly, Chief Executive of Social Enterprise Scotland, to deliver this year's lecture in an effort to stimulate thinking and debate as to the reality of those different responses, in particular social enterprise, and how an enterprise-based vision can have an important role to play in the future development of Scotland and its people. Prior to his current role as Chief Executive with Social Enterprise Scotland, Fraser held the post of Chief Executive with Castlemilk Economic Development Agency and Glasgow South East Regeneration Agency Limited. He joined Social Enterprise Scotland in July 2011. With a career that benefits from private, public and third sector experience and includes over 20 years working in economic regeneration, Fraser now works on behalf of an outstanding collection of member organisations. After the lecture, there is the usual opportunity to ask questions or even to make a comment and seek a response from Fraser or Alan or even myself. I would ask you, as Fraser delivers the lecture, if you kind of clock something you think, I'd like to debate that, or I'd like to question him further on it, please do so. That avoids that embarrassing bit at the end where the questions take a while to come, and then we suddenly run up against the time scale and there are people with their hands up who don't get an opportunity to speak. So please do that. Please take this opportunity to think about how we can all work together. Please stay for the reception and meet old friends and maybe some new friends at the end. Thank you for listening. Without further ado, can I introduce the speaker of this year's Apex Lecture, Fraser Kelly.
In 1979, I went to Hampden to watch Scotland play Argentina. They arrived as champions of the world, and we turned up with an inglorious exit from the 1978 World Cup, with Willie Johnson sent home in disgrace, defeat to Peru and a draw with Iran, only saved by a legendary goal from Archie Gemmill. Diego Maradona made his debut that day and he scored in a 3-1 victory for Argentina. And Arthur Graham, who played for Aberdeen and Manchester United amongst others, scored for Scotland. And 1979 was a signal year for me. I began work with Black & Edgington plc in an industrial estate in Port Glasgow. Black & Edgington were a parent company to a whole host of interconnected international consortium of businesses. Blacks of Greenock, Blacks Camping and Leisure, Blacks Travel Agency, Millet Stores, Black & Edgington Hire, Van Gogh Scotland, Andrew Mitchell, Care and Care, Gaelic Caravans, Players Sports, Camtors Jackson and War, Insight International, and many, many more. The registered office was in Tower Bridge in London, and we had operations extending across the UK and around the world. The head office, though, was in Muirshiel Road in Port Glasgow. This was a legacy of the owners of Thomas Black & Sons, who over a number of years had diversified their business models, looked at their product ranges, their market penetration and their organisational structure. Doyens of the stock exchange, Black & Edgington stock was sought after. The markets followed closely any new developments that we got involved in, and they took an interest. Innovation, progressive thinking and imagination were cultural norms in Blacks. There was a constant encouragement to imagine new ways of working. And in an era when businesses had staff appointed to time and motion studies and organisation and methods rather than strategic planning, Blacks had an ethos of innovation and a set of guiding principles that was about no fear of failure, and that permeated through the organisation. So Robin Duthie was the chief executive at that point in time, and I remember still to this day, and it's been through my working career I've held fast to these views, that he described to me the 3 key things that had made Black & Edgington successful. And primarily it was about local ownership, and that local ownership and control provided for good decision making. In every business that Blacks acquired, there was a recognition that change was inevitable, but where knowledge of customers, markets, systems, procedures and staff existed, it was better to build on that than to discard it. Every member of staff makes a contribution. The Black & Edgington Group were incredibly committed to developing staff. Back then, in the early 80s, the company introduced a savings-related share option scheme, which allowed all of the staff through a salary sacrifice scheme to tie into the ownership of the company. The ethos being that it was the staff who were contributing to the growth, and it was they who should share in it. But most importantly, put your customers at the heart of every decision you make. Always consider the person who uses your product and your service as the most important focus of your attention. It is they who know what they need, and it is they who will tell you how to design the next product to make it better than the last. And I remember fondly looking out from the window of the offices in Muirshiel Road about 4:30 any afternoon, and there would be between 60 and 80 buses sitting outside the window, ready to take people away from Blacks, Playtex, Sangamo, Fescol, AMP, Redditch Needle Factory, the Woven Air, Newey Goodman and so many more. Filling the buses with chatter and heading in every conceivable direction in Inverclyde, to Midden, to Larkfield, to Clinder Road. If you left at 4:30 and you didn't make it to Bruns, down in the Port Glasgow Road, by 20 to 5, the yards exploded, and you sat there for another 30 minutes before you could get through. Lammonts, Fergusons, Browns, Lithgows, Scots, Kincaids, despite many of them being in problems and being nationalised in 1977, were still busy. You'll remember though, or for those of you who do remember, the 70s and 80s were turbulent times and economic uncertainty was equally pronounced. Inflation in the UK was spiralling out of control. VAT had been hiked from 7.5% to 15%. Unemployment was surging beyond 2 million and was in short order ready to reach 3 million. The government of the day were increasing interest rates. This was before the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England existed, and that was to try and stem inflation, and all of which coincided with tax increases, leading to comparisons with the 1930s. Over 2 million jobs were lost in the recession between the 70s and 80s, and in 1983 blacks were subject to a hostile takeover. Former subsidiary, which wasn't wholly owned, was used as a Trojan horse to achieve a dawn raid. We knew the architect of the approach, and we knew their intention was to asset strip. The lucrative and internationally focused tour operator, Insight International, you will still see coaches go around Edinburgh at the moment with Insight Vacations. That's the legacy of Insight International Tours, was the prize, and with most other parts of the group being sold off to a combination of management buyouts and disposals, many parts of the group still operate, but it was essentially an asset stripping exercise. A small aside, Vango Scotland, they were originally based in 47 Colven Street in Glasgow, but they'd originally come from Govan, and for those of you who have quickly got into that abbreviation, Govan was, Vango is an abbreviation of Govan, and I have a wee chuckle every time I hear somebody saying they were in a Vango tent, and I mentioned Vango, that if they've been on their holidays, they've actually been in a form of Govan sheltered housing for their holidays. In 1990, I joined Inverclyde Council, where I went into the finance service and into the capital and management section. And Inverclyde at that time was struggling to cope with the scale of economic decline. The traditional economic base was really struggling, population decline was already evident, and those who were economically active were already leaving to seek their future elsewhere. IBM since 1951 and National Semiconductor since 1967 have been a constant source of really high-skilled and high-waged employment in Inverclyde, but even they were experiencing the threats of globalisation and increased competition. In 1995, many of you will know that local government reorganisation saw the bringing together of the regional and district councils, and with that an establishment of an economic development service in Inverclyde. I joined the service in 1996 and became head of service in 1998. But this was an interesting period because it was also a time when European structural funds were playing an important part in economic regeneration in Scotland. Inverclyde for a time had 100% assisted area status right across the whole local authority area, including Gourock and Kilmacombe. Unfortunately, and in my view, they failed desperately to capitalise on that. Policy interventions at the time were largely national, and in 1988, the UK government granted Inverclyde Enterprise Zone status with incentivised capital allowances and relaxed planning consents available to developers across a series of 27 sites in Inverclyde. Unfortunately, the early stages of the EZ did not develop in the way in which it was envisaged. The archipelago nature of the sites was a problem and meant it was difficult to achieve a critical mass of development interest. Competing investment options with potentially greater returns were available elsewhere, and derelict and often contaminated land conditions were costly to remediate, and end tenants were hard to find. Because of this, investment flows were difficult to predict with any degree of certainty. And some local tensions also existed, with a perception or a perceived focus on attracting foreign direct investment and inward investment over indigenous businesses in Inverclyde, who were core employers of the economic population in Inverclyde. Inverclyde had a small business loan focus, which was quite interesting in terms that it was repayable finance at that point in time, but it was quite innovative for its time, but it was small in scale and unlikely ever to compete with the EZ status. At that time, the Scottish Business Birthright Strategy was being developed, and that hoped to close the gap between the business births in Scotland and the rest of the UK, identified access to finance as a particular barrier, and championed investment in key growth sectors and in technology as a means of future-proofing the economy. Looking back now, I think some of that drive toward the knowledge age economy would have been better to focus on people rather than place and competitiveness. On 21st of June 2004, I walked into the Braes Shopping Centre in Castlemilk. It was my first day at CEDA at Castlemilk Economic Development Agency. I was suited and booted. And as I walked in, I met a guy coming out of the Braes Shopping Centre, and he had a couple of bags of messages in each hand. And he was obviously a wee bit worse for wear. And the thing that I noticed about him, he had highly polished Adidas Sambas training shoes on. And he looked up at me and I looked at him and he said, "Hey, big man, are you CID?" And I said, "No, you must be the social then." There was a couple other words in there that he added in. And I'm sure he went away and he chuckled to himself, "What an idiot." And I thought probably much the same myself. But the worth of mentioning his footwear was that I had highly polished Adidas Samba trainers as well. And as we actually start to talk to the guy, because he was a customer of CEDA at that point in time, we realised that we'd actually played football against each other probably 25 years before then. At that time, the economic outlook for Glasgow was generally a strong and growing economy. The city centre had generated 45,000 new jobs in the previous 10 years, and planned investments included the M74, the Glasgow Airport Rail Link, Clyde Gateway, URC, the Commonwealth Games, the South Glasgow Hospital, and the emergence of the International Financial Services District and significant housing investment from GHA were all leading to the expectation of a further net growth of 13,000 jobs by 2016. The southeast of the city at that point in time, there were nearly 2,800 businesses employing just over 39,000 people, and at average employment rates of 66%, the southeast was really making a significant contribution to Glasgow's economic growth. But that was 2008, 2009, and then there was a crash. And at CEDA we wrestled constantly with differing indicators, which on one hand would tell us that there was a reduction in the number of people who were employment deprived, but yet increases in the number of people who were income deprived. And we struggled to understand if we were doing the right thing, and I suspect we struggled to understand why the policy interventions were structured in the way that they were. Getting people into work was our priority, but getting the people who were most marginal and the people who were, in the language we've used for a number of years, hardest to help, hardest to reach, whatever, was our priority. It wasn't about people who were GISA eligible. The recently published SIMD, the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, I suppose in some ways was very interesting, but it was also very challenging because it shows that much still needs to be done to tackle those fundamental barriers of inequality. And I remember a further conversation with a guy from the Braes, and Ryan, you mentioned earlier on service users. You know that gratuitous thing where you bring your service users together with politicians. And at that point in time, John Hutton was the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and he came to the Gorbals or to Castlemilk, and we got some of our service users involved. And I regaled my frustration at having been involved in all manner of employability programmes, from employment grant schemes to employment training initiatives, through national programmes, training for work, get ready for work, action teams for jobs, New Deal, flexible New Deal, and many, many more. And the riposte came from the back of the room. "Hey, Big Fraser, I've been involved in all of them as well, and I still don't have an effing job." And I didn't know whether I could actually hug him or whether I should hide under the table, but he delivered the message for me much, much better than ever I could. But it was during this time that I came across social enterprise as a business model. The Scottish Social Enterprise Coalition was already established, and it was established in 2005. CEDA weren't eligible as members because our sole member was the local authority. But CEDA operated a wholly owned subsidiary in Castlemilk Property Company. And CPC owned and managed around 20,000 square metres of industrial and business space. And between Glenwood Business Park, Drakemire Drive, Riverside Business Park and the Adelphi, CPC was landlord to more than 70 tenants. We charged roughly £5.50 a square foot plus service charges. There were no leases, only licences to occupy. And we enjoyed close to 100% occupancy every month for about 6 years, and people told me that we would never be able to let industrial and business space in Castlemilk. Most of our tenants had tenure of 8, 9, 10 years and even more. But if you didn't pay your rent, I came to see you on a Friday afternoon. In February 2010, the tenants provided for 648 full-time equivalent jobs, with over 60% of those coming from Castlemilk, Croftfoot and the Gorbals. And for my part, this was the best example I have found and have seen since of economic regeneration delivering a social benefit. CPC had a turnover of about £2 million, about £2 million, and regularly gift aided over £400,000 back to the charitable company. The beauty of that was that it was clean money to us. It was matchable, and it was able for us to use out with the protracted and constrained service level agreements that we had from the public authority and from other parts of the publicly funded infrastructure. I was then hooked on a business model that I thought was able to deliver against all of those things, and I've held fast to it for many years. Locally owned and controlled decision making, recognising that every member of a team makes a contribution, and again, above all, putting the customer at the heart of the decision that we make. So what does social enterprise in Scotland look like? And some of you may have seen the work that was done last September in 2015, the Social Enterprise in Scotland census. And there are some interesting data that have come out of the census. 5,200 social enterprises in Scotland, employing 112,000 people. That's more than life sciences, it's more than food and drink, and it's more than creative industries. Yet they're all priority sectors for our mainstream economic development agency in Scotland. 67,000 volunteers, £1.15 billion worth of traded income, £8.77 billion worth of asset value. That's the housing associations primarily. And some people argue that we should take the housing associations out of this model because it distorts the figures. I believe that the housing associations should be in there as our jewel in the crown. They're asset backed, they have deals to die for, they are locally owned and they are locally controlled, they have independent management committees, and they have a focus on not simply the tenancy holder but in the household, and connect to many people that other agencies do not. 42% of social enterprises started within the last 10 years. Fabulous, 200 social enterprises starting every year. I suppose there's a couple of challenges. 60% of social enterprises are operating at turnover of less than £100,000, and that's pretty tough to pay the wages on a Friday. There's still a piece of data in the census that I still need to understand better, which tells us that 82% of our community and social enterprise activity is outside of the worst 20% of enumeration districts in Scotland, when I think it should actually be inside. Now, that's possibly about headquartered organisations who are actually operating in disadvantaged areas, and indeed we also know that there are many, many people who experience and show the circumstances and characteristics of disadvantage outside of SIMD data zones as there are inside. As I said, that was a signal piece of work for us, and the data captured in the census, I think, are hugely encouraging. Social enterprises now operate across the length and breadth of Scotland, and in every business discipline, from construction and facilities management through financial services and creative industries to IT, sports, life sciences and health and social care, and indeed in criminal justice. It's quite interesting to note that 22% of social enterprises in Scotland operate in the Highlands and Islands, where there is only 9% of the population. So there is something different that's happening in the Highlands and Islands. Highlands and Islands Enterprise have a strengthening communities remit, which does not exist within Scottish Enterprise. But for me, there's also something more fundamental, and it's about the role of social enterprise in supporting fragile communities as much as it is about supporting disadvantaged communities. I live in Kelso, I live in a rural community, having lived most of my natural-born life in Inverclyde. I understand now the differences in the interventions that are required at an urban level and at a rural level. And indeed, I know many people in the borders now who hold down 3 jobs just to make ends meet. What is encouraging is the emergence of new social enterprises. I mentioned over 200 forming each year, and the growth of consumer-facing social enterprise. The data that confirms the over 40% of social enterprises being formed within the last 10 years vindicates some of the challenges and the campaigns that we have had around a dedicated business support infrastructure built around social enterprise. It evidences the opportunity for the growing social investment market, and Alan and I have had a discussion before we did this lecture about funding versus investment, and unfortunately there are still many in the third sector and within the social enterprise community who view funding and investment as the same thing. Fundamentally they are not, and I'm excited about the growth in social investment, but I'm also clear that there are organisations who need that grant funded support as they continue through the business life cycle and the journey that they are on. Social enterprise provides for job creation, and it's most fundamental. It helps to address the wicked and chunky problems that exist in our society. I mentioned that there are 60% of social enterprises operating with turnover of under £100,000, and we need to grow that, but we also need to grow the scale, scope and substance. So what then of the future for social enterprise in Scotland? It is not the panacea for all ills. It will not replace the public sector in its entirety. But it is exciting, and it's much to offer as a business model of choice. I'm encouraged by the economic strategy for Scotland, which positions competitiveness and tackling inequality as 2 mutually reinforcing themes. I believe there is a desire to see social enterprise and other forms of ethical business operate in Scotland. I'm hugely encouraged by the commitment from Scottish Government through the Third Sector Division to the co-production of a social enterprise strategy for Scotland, and that is current at the moment, and we hope will be launched sometime in September or October of this year. I'm excited to see the local social enterprise networks in Scotland constituting and growing into powerful local networks of support. I'm absolutely blown away by the new, young, talented and ambitious collection of social entrepreneurs that are emerging in Scotland, and I'm pleased to see some movement in the recognition by public and private sectors that social enterprise has a role to play in the delivery of public services, but also a role to play in the wider economic base of Scotland. I'm also impressed by the public social partnerships which are emerging, and some of them, there are 5 strategic public social partnerships across Scotland, but there are now many, many more local variations beginning to come to the fore. Now, if you wish to start a business and you want to choose a social enterprise as the way to do that, you can. Now, if a public body wishes to contract with a social enterprise to deliver a service, it can. Now, if the general public want to buy products and goods and services, we can. And I suppose if I use an example which I've not written down here, and many of you will know of the example of Social Bite in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And can I ask, just as a matter of interest, how many people have bought food from Social Bite? And if you have, did you buy a suspended meal? Many of you will have. Anecdotally, 78,000 people over the last festive season bought a suspended meal from Social Bite. A £5 across the counter, and the transactional simplicity is the only record of that is a till receipt. No one expects to get their £5 back. And the basis of Social Bite, taking a sandwich from the shelf and feeding someone who's homeless, is based entirely on trust. I believe we need to examine that model, which is essentially £390,000 worth of crowdfunding by any other means, to get this transactional simplicity into spending the public pound in the same way that our public pound is spent. And I think the public pound is the pound that we have in our pocket, and it's not simply because we've taken it out of our pocket and passed it across to Social Bite. We need to get that into the way that the public sector spends what they perceive as the public pound. How best to harness all of that energy and purpose, and what messages for our policymakers? I suppose it reverts to a relatively cliched phrase which I've worked to for some time. It's about people, place and business. Firstly, by putting people at the heart of every decision we make. It's easy to speak of person-centred approaches, working with the most vulnerable social enterprises. It's less easy to do it. Secondly, a focus on social enterprise being locally owned and locally controlled, and I apologise if you've heard that a number of times this evening, but for me that's fundamental to it, because that's where you get most purchase. And thirdly, understanding the economic circumstances of Greenock, Govan and Galashiels may be similar, but the solutions to addressing those problems may be very different. And finally, by recognising that business is crucial to economic competitiveness, but the innovation is not solely the preserve of manufacturing or technology businesses. There is much more innovation to be had in driving change in the way we do business, rather than focusing only on the business we do. To conclude, and probably back to Hampden in 1979, and I didn't realise that in future years I would find myself thinking of the tenuous yet for me connected circumstances of those events. And whilst working at the Adelphi Centre down in the Gorbals one day, I met another one of our customers, and a guy who regaled me with the story of Alexander Watson Hutton. Born in the Gorbals and widely respected as the founder of the Argentine Football Association. He showed me an article from the Scotsman in 2008, and it was entitled "The Argentine Football Returns to the Roots of its Founder." And this was a report on when Diego Maradona was coming as manager of Argentina at that point in time. And I probably was minded then back to Willie Johnson's disgraceful drug exit from the 1978 World Cup and Maradona's circumstances at that point in time. However, I'm convinced that Alexander Hutton was a social entrepreneur. The background of his story in terms of his family circumstances and how he left the Gorbals and went to Argentina is quite interesting, and what he did there in terms of establishing an English school and making sure that sport and physical activity were interconnected with a business ethic. And of course, there was the Arthur Graham part of it, and Arthur Graham is a Castlemilk boy. I came this evening at the invitation of Alan, and I didn't want to speak to you about the justice system because it's not an area where I have a specific set of skills. I've been close to it most of my working life in terms of the employability focus that I've had. But it was quite interesting. I looked at our website 2 or 3 days ago, and I found we have a blogger. We don't tell anyone who it is, but back in 2008 or 9, the blogger wrote a blog for us, and it was around justice, and then the blog said, we don't have a justice system, we have a legal system. We need new social enterprise to solve some of our petty crime and associated recidivism and prison problems. Our existing system of community service orders is ridiculous. The innovation is to trust people and the victims of crime and not rely on the state for all of the answers. We need to create local social enterprise justice businesses who get involved in designing and managing local solutions programs and monitoring participation and outcomes. The business model requires some of the criminal justice and prisons budget to be diverted into more effective social enterprise model. Ooh, vigilantism, I hear you cry. I don't think so. Tabloid and political manipulation of the imagery and fear of crime has failed every person and every community affected by crime. Ordinary folk feel fearful and resentful because they are marginalised and excluded from the system and the process of justice. They have little faith in justice professionals who don't live in their communities and who don't suffer the consequences of their decisions. Getting social entrepreneurs involved in community rights and justice is the solution. This could mean that what works in one community might not be the same in another. If a justice business designs socio-economic or environmental sentences programmes to be carried out, why do we need an additional state bureaucracy to manage this? The justice business can send their reports to procurers, politicians and the judiciary, the media and local people. Is that not enough? In addition, all victims of petty crime ought to receive a demonstrably sincere apology. This is liberating and restitutive experience for victims and criminals. Justice business would work with criminals and their families to prepare them to make an apology. It's all about giving and receiving, respect in it. Insincerity or refusal will carry a price measured in additional community payback work, deduction of salary benefit, income if criminals do not carry out community payback should remain as a punitive option. Justice businesses would work on contracts with the DWP and HMRC to manage this. That was back in 2010. I'm not sure if those circumstances resonate with your understanding of where we are, but that was a plea at that point in time to begin to establish social enterprise as a business model that can actually start to tackle, as I mentioned, some of Scotland's wicked and challenging problems. I'm delighted that there are so many social enterprises now operating in the justice sector, and indeed speaking to Patrick about what is happening with All Cleaned Up, Track to Train, I think there are some really, really exciting developments in the future. I promised Lynn that when people started to wrap their heads in a wet towel and your ears started to bleed, that I would stop. So I thank you for listening to my ramblings, my musings and my sweeping generalisations. Somewhere in my head they make sense. I hope this has been of interest to you, and I'm happy now, Brian, to take any questions further. So thank you for listening.
At this point, I'm usually advised there are folk with roving microphones around. Yes, there are. Chantel and Vary, thank you. Fraser, thank you very much for that. And I was really pleased at the end that you mentioned All Cleaned Up, because some of our colleagues from All Cleaned Up are here tonight. So if you get a chance and you want to hear about a social enterprise in the justice system, make a point of looking for the All Cleaned Up badges and have a word with them and the work they do. So that's been a little bit of a pause to give you an opportunity. So could I ask for the first question? And if you could say who you are and what organisation you come from, that would help, please.
Hello, I'm David Mackey. I'm the Sheriff in Alloa. I was pleased to hear that little reference earlier on, Brian. But I suppose in this comment, this question, I'm speaking more as the Chair of Chats for Change, a charity which does work in the UK, Nepal and Malawi. We're in the process of trying to acquire a centre in the Lake District. One of the biggest problems that any charity has is finding unrestricted funding. And for a young charity like ours, which is barely 5 years old, that has proved a particular challenge. It leads to difficult cash flow issues and so forth. And we had the bright idea of starting something like a social enterprise at Striding Edge, but we need to buy the place first. We've taken the difficult but important step of trying to borrow money. We've then found that in the third sector, lenders, I think, are few and far between who will lend. And the interest rate that we're being charged is verging on the usury. So my comment is about using social enterprise by charities for raising unrestricted funding and a plea for any bright ideas about finding less expensive and more accessible capital.
Thank you, Sheriff Mackey.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I sit on the board of Resilient Scotland. And Resilient Scotland is a social investor that manages the Jessica Fund, the Jessica Trust. It's a model of a combination of loan and grant funding, which in some ways de-risks the investment of others and helps to, in some way, reduce the interest rate. It's still at 6.5%, which is too expensive when you can build on the high street at 2%. The problem with the high street, even from the ethically focused lenders, Triodos, Charity Bank, Co-op Bank, Unity Trust Bank, they won't go below £1 million. And many social enterprises in the stage that you're in are looking for anything between 50,000 and 250,000. We're keen to see those ethical lenders come to the market in a different way, where they might be able to reduce the arrangement fees or introduce an arrangement fee that allows them to bring investment to you at a level which is below what they currently offer at the moment. I think Scotland's ahead of the game a little bit in terms of some of the social investment work that it's doing. I think what Social Investment Scotland are doing, what Big Issue Invest Scotland are doing, some of the work that Resilient is doing, is now starting to challenge some of those issues around the cost of money. But I think you've hit on a very clear point. There is no absolute failure in the availability of money. The problem is it's not at the right price, it's not available at the right time, it's not available under the right management arrangements. And I think that's the sort of thing that we should be campaigning with government to do, that rather than introduce another series of grant funding which will essentially decimate the social investment market, they should be using that either in some way as a loan guarantee fund or allowing it to de-risk the investment as you go forward.
David.
Thanks very much. I'm David Strang, Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland. Thanks very much for your talk, Fraser. You made a passing reference, I think, to public social partnerships in a positive way, and I would say that I've seen some really good PSPs delivering some good outcomes for people in prison. One of the challenges for them is the model, which is about sustainable funding and mainstream organisations picking up the funding for that. So I wanted to ask you just to say a bit more about PSPs and I suppose what they might learn from social enterprises in terms of sustainability and future funding.
Yeah, I think the PSP model in terms of involving people in the early stage design of the intervention and the outcome, I think, is something that we're beginning to learn. The journey is still early. I wouldn't say it's in its infancy, but in terms of Low Moss and others, there's some really interesting data that are now being captured in terms of the way that those services, etc., are designed. For me, the benefits of the PSP model is that it's replicable, it's transportable, and essentially it can operate in a whole range of different business disciplines. Where I think we have to get more sophisticated around it is understanding that that it becomes genuine co-production. At the moment, I have a concern that some of it is still the public sector involving the third sector in a slightly patronising way to design the outcomes. It is then tendered in a different... It's then tendered, and the opportunity to genuinely co-produce and genuinely be part of the delivery mechanism is still something that the third sector and social enterprise feel that it's slightly marginalised around. I think there's much still to do in those areas. I think there's much still to learn from it, but I think they're genuinely very, very positive. For me, as I say, that the really significant impact of them is that from the 5 strategic partnerships across Scotland, we're now seeing more local PSPs developing. And some of them are not PSPs, but that's the terminology that we're using around them. And if there is any demonstration benefit that's coming from them, I think that has to be a good thing.
Alan, you want to?
Yes, forgive me, but PSPs, although ostensibly something which is really valuable, it's a really good model, and many of us are involved in a variety of PSPs. There's a certain naivety about the whole principle, and I struggle with the possibility that actually it's just a remodelling, a rewording of the old seed corn startup funding process, because as we know, we struggle on this sort of sugar nail of sustainability. The PSPs are fine because they are initially funded, and we expect people to sign up to them and say, of course we will find funding for them when that startup funding runs out. But in an environment where there is no additional money, that then means at some point we're faced with the bitter truth of having to reduce and change the funding that we have. So what we're talking about is resource shifting. Somewhere, at some point, some resource has to be shifted from something else to make that PSP continue. There is a real problem in starting out a process like that. Yes, perhaps it'll get to the stage where it's good enough for people to say we can't possibly live without this, and we will shift lots of money from the other areas of work. But it's darn difficult to do if you are an employer, a local authority employer, a public sector employer, moving funding that was providing core services into something which has been available to you pretty well free for the last 2 or 3 years. The PSPs that we're seeing, not all of them, but many of them are struggling with this particular issue. And I have to ask whether there is a fundamental flaw. It was a nice sounding idea. It is a nice sounding idea. The model and the design are great, but we still haven't moved from the funding. It's basically the same funding process that we've always had. And until we actually change the way services are funded, I'm not sure we're actually going to change very much at all.
That's all. Right, could I invite another question in the front to Lady in White, and then Richard. Could any other folk who are likely to ask questions? Very sorry, the row you're in. Just then. Can they just wave their hands at me? Just. Okay.
I'm Rose Fitzpatrick from Police Scotland. Thank you, Fraser, for so much that is very descriptive but also thought-provoking in what you were saying. Implicit in what you were saying, and actually very clear at points, and also in the questions that have been raised already, is the issue around leadership, and leadership in really constrained and quite naturally, therefore, risk-averse times. There isn't a lot of money about, and people's accountability for how that's spent has never been more visible. So do you think there are opportunities that we're missing, or opportunities which we're not making enough of, to encourage particularly public sector leaders to see social enterprise in a more positive light and to see it as good stewardship as opposed to a risky process that may or may not, if fingers crossed, come out well.
Yes. Interestingly, there are a number of local authorities who are actually developing social enterprise strategies. Some of them are very good at it. City of Edinburgh Council have a strategy which has gone through full council. They've developed then a resource mechanism around funding their business support services. Renfrewshire Council, if you take, again, the leader of the council there wants Renfrewshire to be the social enterprise hub of Scotland. Falkirk Council, Fife, North Lanarkshire, North Ayrshire have now developed a social enterprise strategy. So some are beginning to understand what the worth of social enterprise is. The difficulty is that converting that into practical procurement policies where the commissioners and the procurement officers understand what they're actually trying to achieve is something that's still very marginal. Where we think there are good examples, if we take the housing associations, again, establishing some subsidiary social enterprise activity, there's a bit of a challenge, I think, still with the housing regulator to understand that the potential for the core housing activity to be compromised by social enterprise activity they're concerned around. We believe that there's much more that could be done in those areas. Housing associations are obviously not public bodies, but we do think there's more that could be done within health, within our further education colleges, our universities, our local authorities. And if particularly we look at employability, and we have many social enterprises who are operating in the employability sector, those public bodies are extremely poor at doing what they say on the tin. They say that they will be a route for people who are long-term unemployed or who are most marginal when we're working with them in terms of their employment support, but they don't do it. So we think there's a number of ways that public bodies and the public sector could actually respond, both in terms of their procurement practices, but also in their day-to-day practices of employing people who are furthest away from the labour market. So I think there's huge opportunity, but there's still a lot of work to do around it.
Richard.
Richard Thompson, Clerk Manager Council. There's pockets of entrepreneurship within the prison system and within the criminal justice system. How do we harness that entrepreneurship from our service users and take that into real social enterprise, social entrepreneurship?
We champion people like Matt Fountain at Freedom Bakery. We do more of the type of activity which is working with people to give them the opportunity to understand that enterprise is actually a way that they can empower themselves to do what All Cleaned Up are doing, to look at Track to Train, to look at new ways of actually developing services and products which don't simply outturn in shareholder value, that actually go back to individuals, to addressing their circumstances and empower them to be the owners of their own destiny. I mentioned a lot in terms of my presentation this evening about the focus on the individual. Unfortunately, when I arrived in Castlemilk, I came in at the end of £280 million worth of New Life for Urban Scotland money going into the area. It made a fabulous difference to the physical appearance of the place, but it didn't do very much with the people. And again, I keep coming back to this issue. It's about people, it's about place, and it's about business. So I think much more of our already encouraging and embryonic and emergent social enterprises are the things that we actually need to look at and look at the demonstration benefits that they have, learn from them. Some of them will fail, but businesses out there fail every single day. So let's encourage people to have no fear of failure, look at entrepreneurialism, and it doesn't matter what your circumstances are, we can all be entrepreneurial. So I think using examples of people like Matt and others is what we need to do, and that new young breed of social entrepreneur is coming through now.
One of the encouraging trends that's happened just recently is a move away from referring to people as offenders to actually just referring to them as people with convictions. And when we start to take that viewpoint, realising that the operative word is people. People are people. They have skills, they have abilities, they have potential. Those that have convictions carry with them a set of barriers that can be dealt with and worked with. As you all know, Richard, Apex, we are absolutely committed to finding ways of sidelining those barriers. But after that, it's not good enough just to provide training. It's not good enough to just to provide, here's somewhere to go. At some point, you have to take that next step and actually say, right, let's create an environment where you can take this potential and genuinely use it. And I hope that people will have the opportunity to chat to some of the folk behind the screen later on about just how we do that.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Black from Circle. My role is to generate income for the charity that I work with. And I just wonder, my background comes from a little bit from social enterprise, and I just wonder, does social enterprise always have to be a product, or can it be an impact?
Sorry, can it be?
An impact. Something that has an impact, rather than necessarily a product to sell, but it creates an impact on the public purse, or a positive impact, obviously.
Absolutely, and I suppose I mentioned the way that the Scottish Government are now committing to a social enterprise strategy for Scotland. Back in 2007, with the Enterprising Third Sector Strategy, and we moved through that. We got to 2010 and with the Christie Commission, and Christie was about the preventative spend, and that's one of the areas where I think we have to challenge when we actually see, or when we're challenging with public bodies, how do we actually get that preventative spend reinvested back into the front end of social enterprise activity? Because social enterprise, in my experience, can always meet performance thresholds. It can meet quality standards. It generally can meet financial viability and capability assessments. Where it doesn't work is when we're working with the public sector and we have to compete solely on price. And they don't understand the worth of our social impact. And I do suspect, when I say that, I think I have to caution that at the moment social enterprise isn't strong enough in evidencing its social impact. And all of the data that are captured in the social enterprise census last year in 2015 are by and large economic data. We need to find a model which suggests this is the impact that we're having in terms of the outcomes that we achieve, and we need to be able to monetize that. Because when we go to the Director of Finance in any public body, unless we are able to evidence there's a better net present value from spending your pound there than spending it there, the Director of Finance and Director of Legal Services will always challenge the Commissioner to say, show me where the benefit is. And I think we need to get better at actually evidencing that impact and that benefit.
Thank you. One final question just in the front here. Well, I see. We'll squeeze two questions out. So, sorry, there's a gentleman, just for you, Martin, gentleman here in the same row, and then Martin for the last question. Thank you.
Hello, Fraser. Ian White, I'm a City of Edinburgh councillor, so I'm aware of the strategy, but I also sit on the Finance Committee, and I see both sides of what you're talking about. I actually see procurement as a positive step, largely, because it means that we don't just give a grant to the people who've always got the grant, whether they're delivering or not, or just keep it in-house without any challenge. And some of that is about co-production and some of it's not. But we still get a lot of complaints at committee about that, about those who are trying to provide those services. And at the same time, it's a challenge to actually get things to be procured, because the service providers at present don't want that to change.
Yes.
How do we get round this problem that's actually stifling innovation, whether it's from a social enterprise or in-house or from a more traditional grant-funded third sector body? It's a big question.
It is a big question, but again, I think much of this still remains cultural, and I think we have to get to a situation where both sides of the equation understand what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. And that's why I mentioned the local authorities that have actually taken social enterprise strategies. Indeed, City of Edinburgh have taken it through full council. We need to better... we need better behaviour in social enterprise around consortia arrangements, around joint ventures, around acquisition, around merger. We need to give public bodies evidence of a scalability and of a being able to replicate services. We need to be able to evidence that their investments, and procurements are investments, that those investments are likely to return at the outcomes which you expect to achieve. I suppose what we would like to think is that whilst the assumption is always that public bodies, our ask is to deal direct with social enterprises. It's not. It's for you to ask everyone whom you are contracting with not to provide gratuitous community benefit clauses. And you know, my experience of doing capital projects in the local authority in Inverclyde, and the gratuitous community benefit clause which said you have to have X number of people involved in the contract as new entrants from long-term unemployed. They're unsophisticated, they're very blunt, they're done at best endeavours, and they will probably be thrown back at you in terms of it will cost more. What we would like you to do is encourage every part of your procurement process to add a social enterprise into a supply chain, whether that be within private sector contractors whom you're working with. And Edinburgh has actually got quite a good track record of asking people to work to specific procurement duties around some of the investments, and I think at the moment, particularly around your IT investment, there's a healthy engagement with the social enterprise sector around support, which is not directly related to social enterprises who operate in the IT industry. So I think it's more creativity around thinking, how could we get social enterprise into the supply chain, but in a way which obliges neither you nor the organisation that you're contracting with to be the person who's responsible for capturing the social impact. Let's have the social enterprises who are involved in the supply chain involved in there on the basis of trust that says, we think we understand that you know what you're trying to do, and if you are working with people who have a conviction record, people who have learning disabilities, people who have mental health problems, people who are long-term unemployed, if that is what the social enterprise is doing, then let's trust that that measure is something which fulfills through to the contract outcomes, not oblige them to capture something which is gratuitously different from what they're doing already. And I can regale you with the organisations across Scotland who still have 27 different funders and 27 different attribution models. So, but I think we're making progress. I think there's much to be encouraged by.
Martin.
My question first, because it's a very similar vein, so I'll try and ask it a bit differently. Martin Colley, Director for the Big Lottery Fund in Scotland, but my question's from a previous role as well, as Chief Executive of Turning Point Scotland, where we had a number of small social enterprises that really struggled to get beyond an income of above 60-65% from trading, really. That ranges from small community cafes to sort of retail outlets and things like that. And my question is, whilst those were very successful models for social outcomes, my question really is about where we can get the right balance between to replicate and scale further investment through public investment under very progressive policy context. I have to say the policy context isn't the problem really, but how we can get the balance right between public investment and social investment, because sometimes the social investment prematurely is too high a risk to take, where the underpinning of the public investment would give you the confidence for further scaling up through social investment, perhaps. Where do we strike the balance? Is that the question?
Martin, it's a fabulous question because it's really emerging and quite new territory. We're now seeing a number of social enterprises who are actually thinking about not abandoning their primary purpose activity, but entering into entirely commercial activity, which will then gift aid resources back in to the charitable activity, which is about the primary purpose. So organisations are beginning to grow, but they're growing within a group structure. And I think, again, this is where they're having encouraging discussions with Oscar to make sure that that non-primary purpose activity is captured within their charitable aims and objectives because of the gift aiding of surpluses back into the organisations. I think that's giving us some ability to see growth. It is giving us the ability to see that opportunity for joint venture, for merger. And as you're absolutely right about the policy context, where my frustration rests at the moment, if you take an example of the very encouraging community empowerment legislation that's gone through and the asset transfer processes that could be happening. If we see social enterprises who at the moment don't have an asset on their balance sheet, and we are able to use the community empowerment legislation to transfer public assets to those social enterprises, which allow their balance sheet to strengthen, then the social investment and commercial investment will flow to those organisations in a more or a less risk-averse way. Once that financial capability and viability is strengthened, their ability then to bid for public service contracts becomes much more credible. And when public procurement is actually looking at them, they are seen then to have an equitable status rather than having been seen previously as enthusiastic amateurs doing a professional job. So I think we've got to look at that policy environment, Martin, and make it work better. It simply won't happen if you say it needs to happen. We need to see some cultural change and actually see some best practice and see some examples of this beginning to emerge. And I think they are starting to show their faces. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, Martin. And it was Hampden that I went to, Martin. It wasn't another. Community interest companies are exciting, Martin, and there is a little bit of, the jury's out a little bit on community interest companies which are Schedule 3. And you may or may not be aware that community interest companies which are Schedule 2 allow for a distribution cap on dividends, but that's back to a parent organisation. Schedule 3 allows for equity investment to come into the organisation, and that's where we're seeing some quite interesting developments. There's a young organisation in Aberdeen, Eurobiotics KIC, which is operating in the life sciences industry, and is now, it's a Schedule 3 community interest company, and we're actually starting to see them court some equity investors. Freedom Bakery, I think, is a really good example because it's got one of the first social investment tax relief investments coming into it. And again, that's something that Matt Fountain has worked really, really hard to be creative around. And you know, there aren't many social investment tax relief models in Scotland at the moment, but that's certainly one that I think could be replicated.
Thanks for that, Fraser. And that concludes our question and answer session. One of the things that we always do at the annual lecture, APEX Scotland launches its annual report. You've got some taster pages in the delegate pack, and I hope it'll encourage you to go onto the website to see the report. The more observant among you will say, I wonder why he's mentioning that now. Did he forget earlier? I shall say nothing on that score, but I have now mentioned our annual report. Quite important to us. I'd now like to invite our Chief Executive, Alan Staff, to close the event.
Our objective every year in planning the APEX lecture is to try to challenge existing practice or thinking. It's to stimulate new ideas in the field of justice service provision and maybe set in motion changes in policy or planning which will benefit our communities and promote a fairer and more positive response to crime and its effects. From the discussion we've just had and the depth of the questions, I think it's been clear that Fraser has managed to tick most of those boxes. He's had an insightful view right across our socio-political landscape, going back more years than either he or I would care to imagine. I found the depth of our understanding about how we get to be where we are now really quite important. It's quite valuable. It sets the context for where we find ourselves. But it also provides us warnings, and it also provides us guidance. And I believe his vision, and I believe the optimism that he puts forward at a time when, let's face it, optimism seems quite hard to come by. I found that challenging and inspiring. And I thank you, Fraser, for sharing that depth of knowledge, but also the insight and the thoughtfulness that comes from all of that. APEX, in line with most other third sector organisations working in the justice field, has had to adapt and evolve its approach away from traditional dependency on public or charitable funding exclusively, to embrace what is actually quite a scary world, the world of social enterprise and business. It's meant an abandoning of a security blanket which we thought was ours by right. And it's come as a rude awakening to find that at some point we had to grow up. And we've had to do a lot of growing up very quickly over the past 6 or 7 years. Taking our first tentative steps into the world of business with the All Cleaned Up enterprise, we had to learn some hard lessons about business reality, and boy did we have to learn them. Among other things, we learned that it's the market which dictates the model and not the other way around. And most importantly, maybe, we learned that people with convictions have a huge uphill climb in getting decent employment until they can demonstrate the ability to adapt to a working environment and display the attitudes which most employers now put above training or experience. Employers are employing on the basis of a person's attitude, not necessarily on the training that they bring. Our system has encouraged us to think about training people and giving training skills. Actually, when we're talking to employers, that's not the thing that they're looking for, first of all. First of all, they're looking for somebody who will listen. First of all, they're looking for somebody who will adapt, who will take instruction, who can hold down a job. The training can come later. You start with the person. Maybe it's not enough to hope somehow that the private sector will altruistically abandon its fears and open up its doors to people with a criminal record just because it's the socially responsible thing to do. Maybe, as we've talked today, maybe we have to find a way of bridging the gap between being job ready and actually being employable. Apex is developing a range of responses to this problem, a number of which we're going to invite you to look at during the reception, which I have pleasure inviting you to. You'll not only find information about All Cleaned Up, which we've talked a lot about, and I encourage you, as has already been said, to go and speak to the guys there and have a look at what's going on. But there's also the opportunity, if you like, the first glimpse, the first showing of our new, exciting new venture in partnership with ScotRail Alliance to provide a brand new social enterprise in the Midlothian area, which promises not only to be innovative, but a huge asset to the area and a benefit to the Scottish economy and to the Scottish tourist industry. We're really very, very excited by that. Have a look at it, talk to the people involved. I think you'll probably catch the enthusiasm that's going on there. If you want to be involved with it and you've got a few spare quid, then we'll be very happy to talk to you. We have big ideas for those who use our services, but we have to find ways of making financial sense too. And on that note, and with gratitude really to Fraser for taking us down that road, we're very, very happy to discuss that further at our reception backstage. So it only remains for me to thank the staff of the wonderful Signet Library, as always, for their help. It's a fabulous place, I'm sure you agree, and we're always well looked after. To thank Lynn and her team for running the show and putting everything together. As always, runs like clockwork, bit like the Swan, with lots going on underneath. She just sort of seems to sail through it all. And of course, thank you to Fraser for such a helpful and challenging lecture. Those of you who can stay, please join us. Those of you who can't, thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting it. I hope you found it beneficial and challenging and safe home. Thank you.